sea is a liar. It promises escape, yet steals all you hold dear. It offers silence, but whispers cruel secrets to the shore. For 5 long years, Clara Whitby stood on the cliffs of Port Haven, clinging to a sailor's promise, waiting for the man the sea had swallowed. But when a storm finally brings a stranger to her feet, bearing her lost love's ring, Clara must face a terrifying question. Did the sea keep its promise, or send her a living betrayal? Prepare yourself for a tale of deep devotion, devastating secrets, and a love that burns brighter than any lighthouse flame. This is The Girl Who Waited by the Sea. Don't miss a single moment of this sweeping romance. Tap the subscribe button now and let the current pull you in. Part 1, The Waiting Woman. The 5th year, it was said, in Port Haven had been the cruelest. The first 4 years of a great sorrow were spent in the throes of hope and the wild, clinging belief that a thing lost might yet be found. But the fifth year was when the world declared the loss permanent, branding the waiting soul a fool. And yet, there was Clara Whitby. She did not feel cruel. She felt only what she was, loyal. The air on the cliffside of Port Haven was not merely cold. It was brine-laced and sharp, a wind that seemed to carry the very scent of distant shipwreck. It was the night of the equinox, a time when the sea grew restless and the shadows lengthened early. The very night, 5 years past, that the schooner the Mariner's Promise had been swallowed by a gale and its entire crew, including the first mate, Thomas Hale, had been deemed lost to the deep. Every year on this night, the villagers would watch as the daughter of the lighthouse keeper performed her ritual. They called her, with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination, the girl who waits. Clara ignored them. The whispers were as irrelevant as the gulls' cries. Her father, Mr. Whitby, had retreated to the upper gallery of the lighthouse, his lamp a steady, revolving comfort to the vessels, still sane enough to sail on a night such as this. But Clara was bound to the cliff edge, to the precise spot where she and Thomas had last stood. She wore a gown of dark, sturdy wool, her hands gloved against the chill as she carefully unwrapped the oil lamp she carried. It was a small thing made of brass and thick glass, and its flame was a mere tremor against the oncoming darkness. Yet to Clara, it was the only light that mattered. As she struck the match, she remembered the last moments clearly. Not a memory, but a perfect, shimmering presence. Thomas, his skin smelling of salt and sun, his eyes the color of the rough, shifting sea he loved too much. He had laughed, a sound like gravel and warmth, tucking her hair behind her ear. "No matter how far the sea takes me, Clara," he had vowed, his voice a promise whispered into the thunder of the waves below, "I will always find my way back to you." A promise. It was not merely a farewell. It was a bond forged by fire and seawater. And Clara Whitby was not a girl to take a man's solemn word lightly. Her devotion, the villagers mistook for madness, was in fact the very core of her stubborn, quiet heart. She held on to that promise as a survivor clings to a piece of floating wreckage. Without it, she would drown in grief. Her love for a ghost was all that kept her alive, and she instinctively knew all that was keeping her tragically trapped. She placed the lit lantern upon a flat stone and watched its small, valiant beam cast a circle of defiant light against the wild blackness. A gust of wind, sudden and savage, threatened to extinguish it. Clara shielded the glass, her back rigid. This was the moment her father always feared. Down in Port Haven, they said the old keeper's daughter was wasting away, driven to folly by the very element her father was meant to guard against. Mrs. Redfern, the innkeeper, was the chief spreader of tales, declaring Clara cursed, suggesting the sea had not merely taken her love, but had stolen her wits as well. The thought of her father, the dear gray-haired man who kept the honest, rhythmic beat of the light, brought a pang of familiar guilt. He had pleaded with her only this morning. "Daughter, I beg you," Mr. Whitby had said, his voice thick with age and worry. "Let the ghost go. The sea has had its due. Do not give it your life as well." She had merely pressed his hand, unable to speak the contradiction. "If I let go of him, Father, I let go of the one thing that proved I was truly loved." A deep, rolling crash of thunder fractured the sky, and the air crackled with a storm that had been brewing all day. The rain began not in drops, but in sheets, instantly soaking her wool cloak and plastering strands of dark hair to her cheeks. Clara kept her vigil, her eyes fixed on the black, churning expanse where the waves rose and collapsed like monstrous, hungry beasts. The lantern flame flickered, a stubborn pulse against the dark, and then, through the deluge, she saw it. It was not the steadfast beam of a large ship, nor the familiar cold eye of her father's light. It was a single, low-riding light on the water, a small, desperate glimmer, bobbing dangerously, moving inexorably toward the perilous rocky cove known as the Dragon's Tooth. It was a small boat, a dinghy perhaps, utterly at the mercy of the elements. A cry, barely audible over the roaring storm, reached her. Instinct, sharpened by 5 years of waiting for a miracle, took over. She snatched up her lantern, her skirts heavy with rain, and scrambled down the narrow, slippery path toward the cove, where the water churned into white, lethal froth. By the time she reached the curve of sand, a wretched, stony patch at the mouth of the cove, the dinghy had capsized, smashed against a boulder. And there, half sprawled on the wet sand, half submerged in the retreating surf, was a man. He was large, his shoulders broad even beneath his soaking, dark clothes. He was still, utterly still. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, Clara thought it was only a body delivered by the tide, another cruel reminder. She dropped her lantern and rushed to him, turning the man onto his back. His face was a mask of exhaustion and pallor, his features rugged, perhaps handsome, but deeply lined with a sorrow that seemed too old for his apparent years. He was not Thomas. Her hope, so foolish and bright only moments before, immediately guttered out, leaving her weak with disappointment and the cold of the sea. As she reached for his wrist, searching for a pulse, her hand brushed against something cold and hard, resting just beneath his collarbone. It was a simple silver ring, tied to a frayed leather cord around his neck. Clara's breath hitched, a painful knot in her chest. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the small, tarnished circlet from beneath the heavy, soaked fabric. It was too simple to be mistaken. On the inside, barely visible in the faint light of the receding storm, were the initials she had etched there herself 5 years ago. CW+TH, the ring. The very ring she had pressed into Thomas's palm the day he sailed. The sailor who never returned was not here, but his most sacred possession was. This stranger, washed up in the tempest, wore her beloved's ring. Clara looked from the cold silver to the man's haunted, unconscious face, and the world seemed to tilt. The sea had not merely kept its promise, she realized with a sickening lurch of terror and longing. It had finally sent her something back. But was it a message or a curse? Part 2. The Man from the Sea. The world returned to the stranger in fragments of sound, the rhythmic groan of the lighthouse mechanism, the insistent, demanding cry of a gull, and the low, careful tread of soft-soled shoes on a wooden floor. The scent was not the usual reek of brine and cold iron he associated with his profession, but a clean, delicate mixture of damp linen and wood smoke. When he finally forced his eyelids open, the light was painful. A stark, unfamiliar morning flooding a small, tidy room high in the lighthouse. He was tucked beneath a heavy quilt, his soaked clothes replaced by a borrowed, rough flannel shirt. A woman was sitting beside the narrow bed. He knew her instantly, with a conviction that rattled him to the bone, though his mind offered no name, no memory, no logical context for this profound recognition. She was pale, her features delicate, yet possessed of a remarkable, enduring strength around the jaw and eyes. Her hair, the color of dark mahogany, was neatly pinned, and her hands, resting in her lap, were the capable, practical hands of a woman accustomed to hard work and patience. It was the eyes, however, that captured him, a shade of stormy gray filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow that made his chest ache in sympathy. They looked at him as if he were a long-lost letter, desperately sought yet feared to be opened. The man pushed himself up, his head swimming with the effort. He felt as if he had been disassembled by the sea and put back together incorrectly. "You are awake," she said, her voice low and composed, betraying nothing of the tumult he sensed beneath the surface. It was a voice that belonged to the quiet hours of the dawn. "Where? Who?" he began, his throat dry and unused. "You are in the Port Haven lighthouse, sir. I am Clara Whitby. My father is the keeper. You were brought in after the storm." Her gray gaze did not waver. "And you are the only one who survived." He frowned, searching the vacant halls of his mind. Shipwreck. A cold snap of fear. Water. "My name," he managed, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "Nathaniel Gray. I believe I was a merchant sailor." It was the only certainty he could retrieve. Nathaniel Gray. The rest was a swirling, opaque fog. No destination, no vessel, no history. Only a crushing sense of guilt, heavy as a stone in his gut, though he could not name the transgression. Clara moved then, folding her hands more tightly. "Mr. Gray," she said, her tone suddenly formal, "I must ask you a question that cannot wait." She reached for the chest of drawers and returned with a small, tarnished silver ring tied to a leather cord. She held it up, letting the faint morning light catch the simple, hand-etched initials. "Where did you acquire this?" The sudden demand shook him. Nathaniel stared at the ring, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he looked at the ring, he heard the faint roar of water and a desperate, whispered farewell. I do not know," he confessed, the truth humiliating. "It was around my neck when I woke. I only have fragments, Miss Whitby. The sea took my memory, I think. Only broken images." He closed his eyes, straining. A large ship, a name, the way the wave broke, and a word, whispered on the foam. He opened his eyes, meeting her intense, expectant gaze. The name was Clara. Clara went white, a visible shock passing through her. She clutched the ring tightly, the silver biting into her palm. A terrible, illogical yearning pulsed in her chest. Thomas sent him. It was the only way to reconcile this impossible man with the irrefutable ring. Perhaps her love, her steadfast waiting, had compelled the sea to give up its secrets. Perhaps this man, Nathaniel Gray, was merely a messenger, a vessel sent from beyond the veil to deliver Thomas's final testament. She desperately wanted to believe he carried some message from her lost love, some beautiful, redemptive coda to her 5 years of grief. She wanted him to speak of Thomas, his laugh, his life, his final thoughts, and then she could finally, truthfully, let him go. "You will rest now, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice regaining its composure, but brittle, like thin ice. "You are safe here, but when your memory returns, I must know every detail of how this came to you." And so began the strange, unsettling convalescence of the man from the sea. Clara, compelled by a duty she could not name, nursed him with a fierce attention that masked her inner turmoil. She brought him broth and tea, changed his bandages, and spoke only in necessary practical terms. But every time their hands brushed, when she steadied his arm or offered a mug, a subtle, electric spark passed between them. It was a recognition that had nothing to do with Thomas or the ring, but with the immediate, undeniable presence of the living. She was drawn to his rough-hewn silence, to the intensity of his gaze, which never left her face for long, and he watched her with a mute, searching sorrow, as if she were a precious, shattered thing he was afraid to touch. This silent, complicated current of attraction was muted by guilt. Her guilt for feeling anything at all when her heart belonged to a ghost, and his guilt for a nameless past he could not recall. One clear afternoon, as the low sun slanted through the watchtower window, Nathaniel sat by the fire, whittling a piece of driftwood into a smooth, elegant shape, an entirely unconscious action. Clara was mending a tear in her father's coat. The silence was companionable but heavy. To break it, she began to hum. It was an old folk melody, a sea ballad called The Sailor's Reckoning, melancholy and lilting, which she had learned as a child. It was the tune Thomas had always teased her about, claiming it was too sad for a sailor's wife. As she reached the second verse, 5 years I waited on the sand for the love that near returned, she noticed something impossible. Nathaniel's deep, quiet voice had joined hers. He was humming the exact, complicated melody, the phrasing perfect, his gaze still fixed on the knife blade and the curving wood in his hands. He was utterly unaware of what he was doing. Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. Her blood ran cold, then hot. She froze, a statue of terror and rising dread. The ballad was local to Port Haven, a rare, obscure tune rarely sung outside the old fishing families. Thomas had been the only person from outside the town who had ever heard her sing it. How could a mysterious sailor named Nathaniel Gray, a man with a shattered memory who wore her dead love's ring, know the private, particular cadence of a tune sung only in the small, lonely chambers of the lighthouse? She stopped humming abruptly. The silence returned, loud and accusatory. Nathaniel looked up, startled by the sudden break in the music. "Did you stop, Miss Whitby? It is a fine tune. Very old, I think." He rubbed his jaw, a flicker of confusion crossing his rugged features. "But I cannot recall where I heard it." Clara rose, folding her mending with forced precision, the tremor in her hands barely contained. Her heart was beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. "It is merely an old song, Mr. Gray," she replied, her voice dangerously smooth. But her gray eyes, fixed on him now with a searching, fearful intensity, held the true, terrifying question. Who are you, really? And more terrifyingly, is it possible the sea has returned Thomas to me only in a stranger's skin?
Tell me how you came by this. It is my family's crest.
I can't remember.
Part 3. Echoes of the Deep. The incident with the sea ballad did not break the ice between Clara and Nathaniel Gray. Rather, it rendered the ice dangerously thin. Every interaction became a tightrope walk over an abyss of unsaid things. Clara's initial devotion, her desire to believe him a messenger from Thomas, was slowly curdling into a frightening suspicion. She observed Nathaniel now not with hope, but with the chilling scrutiny of a detective piecing together a terrifying puzzle. Nathaniel, in turn, seemed increasingly restless. The confines of the lighthouse, once a safe harbor, now felt like a prison to his fractured mind. The guilt he carried, unnamed but profoundly felt, drew him constantly to the high windows and the very edge of the cliffs. He began to regain flashes of memory, not of his own identity, but of the final moments of the wreck. He spoke to Clara only in generalities, describing the brutality of the storm, the screaming of the rigging, and the noble effort of the ship's captain, a small but crucial detail which Clara noted with a tightening coil of anxiety. His fragmented recall centered around a final, desperate promise made in the roaring dark, a promise he could not yet articulate, but that seemed to be the source of his profound, unsettling sorrow. Open quote, "It was not just a wreck, Miss Whitby," he said one evening, staring out at the turbulent gray expanse of the sea. "It was a sacrifice. Someone bought my life with their own." Close quote. His eyes, when he turned them toward her, were full of a recognition that transcended their brief acquaintance. Open quote. "And I feel I have been tasked with a duty I am failing, a message I cannot deliver." Close quote. This haunted declaration spurred Clara to action. She could no longer rely on faith. She needed facts. Slipping away during the morning watch, she ventured into Port Haven, braving the knowing, sharp glances of the villagers and the outright disapproval of Mrs. Redfern, who sniffed loudly when Clara entered the archives above the town council's office. Clara spent 2 hours poring over the brittle, salt-stained ship ledgers and the grim records of the Royal Coast Guard. She searched the details of the wreck of the Mariner's Promise, looking for crew rosters, survivor reports, anything that listed the sailors lost 5 years ago. Her search yielded not a comfort, but a sickening impossibility. The ship was lost with all hands. Every name listed in the roster of the deceased was there, confirmed by the Admiralty report. And there, beneath the names of the captain and 2 deckhands, were the final definitive entries. Hale, Thomas, first mate. Lost at sea. Gray, Nathaniel, merchant sailor. Lost at sea. Clara stared at the ink until the letters swam, her breath caught thin and sharp in her lungs. Nathaniel Gray was listed among the dead. The man who slept 2 floors above her, who ate her father's bread and wore Thomas's ring, had been officially recorded as drowned 5 years ago. He was not a messenger nor a survivor. He was an impossible ghost, a man risen from the sea bearing the name of the lost and the token of her beloved. She fled the archives, the rough, salty wind of Port Haven seeming to mock her devotion. Her faith, the very thing she had clung to, was shattering. That night she could not sleep. She heard Nathaniel pacing in his room, the steady thump of his boots, a counterpoint to the distant, rhythmic turning of the light. She knew she should confront him with the ledger, demand the truth, but a deeper, more irrational fear held her back, the fear of what the truth would demand of her. She began to avoid his eyes, unable to reconcile the handsome, living reality of him with the knowledge that his name belonged to a grave at the bottom of the ocean. But even as she recoiled, the bond between them tightened in the dark, silent chambers of the lighthouse. Nathaniel, too, was in torment. He dreamt of her constantly, not the woman he knew now, but a memory of her, laughing on a sun-drenched beach, her hand in his. He swore, truthfully, that he had never met her before the storm, yet the dreams were visceral and intimate, filled with a tenderness that terrified him. Late that evening, drawn by a need he could not articulate, Clara found him on the narrow, winding stairwell, staring out a small window at the sea. The moonlight painted his rugged profile in silver and shadow. He was whispering. She paused, concealed by the darkness. Open quote. Clara, he murmured, the name a soft yearning sound torn from his soul. Why did you wait? Close quote. The tenderness in the whisper, the intimate pain in his voice broke her reserve. She stepped out of the shadow. Open quote. Nathaniel, she said, her voice shaking. Tell me who you are. Close quote. He spun around, startled, his expression shifting instantly from a vulnerable contemplation to one of immediate anguish. He was close, too close, and the air between them was thick with unresolved grief and a terrible living longing. Open quote. I wish I could tell you, he said, his voice husky. Every time I look at you, Miss Whitby, it feels like remembering, like I'm reaching for a life I once lived, only to find the door locked. Close quote. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek as if drawn by an invisible, powerful tide. Clara leaned into the space, her own loneliness and years of repression exploding in a sudden, desperate need to feel the warmth of a living man. They nearly kissed. The air crackled, their hearts hammering a violent rhythm against the silence of the tower. It was not Thomas, it was fire. It was a dizzying, terrifying release. But just as their lips were about to meet, Nathaniel cried out, a strangled, agonized sound, and wrenched himself away. He pulled back as if burned, clutching the silver ring that rested beneath his shirt with a white-knuckled grip. His eyes were wide with a devastating mixture of guilt and self-loathing. Open quote. No, he choked out, his voice hoarse. I cannot. I must not. Close quote. He turned his back on her, leaning his forehead against the cold stone of the wall. The emotional tension was unbearable, thick enough to choke on. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but the sound of two hearts breaking. Hers from the shock of desire and the shattering of her vows, his from the guilt of a promise he still could not recall, but knew instinctually he was dangerously close to betraying. Clara stood motionless, her hand pressed to her mouth, breathing shallowly. The truth that this man was a ghost of Thomas, a living embodiment of the betrayal the sea had sent her, was becoming too heavy to bear. Open quote. You will tell me everything, Nathaniel, she whispered, the name tasting sharp and forbidden on her tongue, or you must leave this place by dawn.
Nathaniel, please don't leave me. I cannot bear this.
I'm sorry, Clara.
I must.
And so, the haunting tension mounts. Clara has seen the truth of the town ledgers. She knows the man she is nursing is a ghost with the name of a dead man. Nathaniel carries a fever in his blood and a desperate, half-recalled promise in his soul. In the darkness of the high tower, they nearly kissed, but the very ring meant to bind Clara to the past ripped them apart. The air in the lighthouse is electric, heavy with unspoken accusations and undeniable desire. Clara has demanded the truth. Nathaniel knows he must tell her. But the sea, the great, unforgiving force that holds all their secrets, is about to make its next move. This concludes part 1 of our story. Stay with us for part 2 when the storm breaks and the deep, cruel truth beneath the waves is finally exposed.